the way we kind of view interventions into aging and like interventions that have the potential to increase healthy lifespan is one of them is actually like delay or prevent aging, which would fit squarely in this like age slower bucket. But then there's also kind of like three other areas of this field that we're really interested in that don't involve necessarily like aging slower to the same extent. One of those is like replacing aging, the notion of swapping out aged organs or cells with young organs or cells. Another of which is like the ability to actually turn back the clock. So the potential to actually restore age to a younger extent, which again wouldn't necessarily be kind of aging slower as much as like turning back the clock. If that were possible, the evidence is pretty unclear at this point, but it's a fascinating space.
You're thinking of building a company or already run a company that is not registered, but you want to get registered. I've looked at a lot of solutions, and one of the best ones in the market right now is Doula. I reached out to Arjun, who is actually the founder of doula.com. I asked him if he'd like to work together on the podcast. He was like, of course. Doula is sort of a platform that helps founders and businesses form and manage US companies, regardless of where they live. If someone is living in India, for example, and wants to start a company and get it registered in the US, he or she can do it by using doula.com. Doula helps in forming the company. It can be an LLC, C Corp, or you name it. Doula offers a US address and a bank account to users, which can allow you to conduct business transactions that you can receive and send payments no matter where you live in the world from the United States. And other than that, they also provide tax consultation to the users, which is an incredible feature. And Doula simplifies the process of establishing and managing a US company, and especially for founders that are not in the US. And regardless of where they live, you can get your company registered with doula.com. To check out Doula, go to doula.com/exerton. That is DOOLA.com/EXERTON. Hey Alex, how are you? Hope you're doing well.
Hello. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, I've been eyeing this one for a very, very long time. And before we get into the other stuff that we have laid out in the incredible document that I make, who is Alex? Who are you?
Yeah, I mean, who is Alex? First of all, I'm a Mainer. So I grew up in Maine and am obsessed with it. I think a large part of me will always just be geographical identity to some extent. And like, what does that mean to me? Well, I mean, in part, it's like a very laid back place, very like in touch with nature, just like beautiful, stunning nature, just like people very down to earth and nice. But I think most pertinent to the discussion today, Maine's actually like a really old state by median age of the population. So Maine is actually the oldest state in the country, if by median age of the population. And like what that means is you actually grow up in Maine and you feel all the effects of age. You feel, neighbors around you and people in town having to deal with age-related diseases. And so as a result of that, who is Alex? I was shaped entirely by Maine and kind of realized that the biology of aging and kind of really understanding why and how humans age and how to intervene in that has really become my identity to some extent.
That's a great introduction, but going forward from that too, why do humans age? Why am I getting so old these days?
Yeah, really good question. Evolutionarily, like why we age, I think is still not really well understood. I mean, I can give the like surface explanations that I think people do, which is just like nearly everything wears down and degrades with time. But even then, it's still not really clear evolutionarily, like why. Some people have tried to talk about the need to make room for offspring and not in essence like leave enough resources for next generations, or to be able to maintain evolution and kind of genetic diversity with evolution. But the really high level answer is we're just like not really sure why we age, and it seems like some species don't in the same ways that humans do. I mean, we certainly know that. Like lobsters, for example, reproduce and grow bigger until the day they die, reproduce more and more and grow bigger until the day they die, which is very unlike the human experience. We also know animals like Hydra, for example, and the naked mole rat that seemingly, over time and as they age, don't experience an increased rate of mortality. So yeah, all that to say, I don't really know why humans age. It's not super clear, but what we do know is that some animals don't age in the same way.
What's a better question? Is it better to ask why do humans age or how do humans age?
Both insanely hard to answer. But I mean, how is at least a little bit more actionable, in my opinion, in terms of the part after that, which is like, okay, then what do we do about it? And in terms of how humans age, it's at the highest level, I like to think of it as just small little things, growing wrong during all aspects of cellular function and tissue function and organismal function. And those small deviations and things going wrong kind of accumulating with time until all of a sudden the kind of macro phenotype is a lot different than it used to be. And that kind of is this like time dependent physiological decline that we know as aging. But in terms of the more specifics of how the field throws around a lot of different small things that go wrong that could be, more important than others, like epigenetic changes or DNA damage or genomic instability or, defects in mitochondria or defects in our ability to recycle aged proteins or accumulated proteins. And we kind of think a lot of these things probably have effects, but we really don't understand kind of ranked order of magnitude or importance of all these various factors in terms of how we actually age.
Why though? I mean, we have made so much progress in a lot of scientific fields, but why not here?
Yeah, like in part, just like maturity of the field, the origins, the kind of modern origins of the field were really in kind of the 1970s, 1980s in worms, where we were able to show that, just by mutating a single gene, you could extend the healthy lifespan of worms. And then, throughout the entire 1980s, 1990s, the field was really viewed as kind of a backwash field that didn't, carry a lot of prestige or respect from greater scientific community. It was really viewed as like a field of bad science or, people who were ultra believers. And so for a while, the field was really consumed for kind of the first 30 years of the field, mostly consumed by like a lot of, one, just like not a lot of resources, not a lot of attention. Two, a lot of like charlatans, snake oil salesmen, which is still a huge problem of the field today. And three, it just takes like time for these things. And so I think it's that kind of combination of things of just like not enough resources, needing time for tool sets, and like to just actually be able to have the molecular tools to study a lot of these things or intervene in a lot of these things. And I think that like now we kind of have a totally ripe and kind of fertile ground for progress in this space. But it just took us like 45 plus years to really accumulate that level of like high quality talent, molecular tools, and progress in the science to be able to be where we are today, where we can actually do that.
And then Brian Johnson comes along.
I think this was one of the most surprising things to me of the past year in this field, right? A year and a half now, I guess, which was totally unexpected to me. But because it was very unexpected to me in part because in general, I think the narrative on the aging field is people don't like the notion of ultra high net worth multimillionaires, just caring about their own health exclusively as kind of like their biggest focus. And to my surprise, Brian Johnson has been a total phenomenon in terms of getting the eyeballs of the world to focus on this field. So much so that I was in Turkey a couple months ago, and I had taxi drivers. When I told them that I worked in the field of longevity, I had taxi drivers that said, "Oh my gosh, Brian Johnson? I know your field, Brian Johnson. That's like you work in Brian's field." So yeah, it's been a, a pretty wild phenomenon to watch. And I think like the macro lesson there is just that like there is now this there is now this, some people call it like a mind virus, like a longevity mind virus. Other people call it just the fact that people realize how big of an unmet medical need this is. And now there's this understanding by way more people than we ever thought there would be at this point that this field is something that people need, and that like this is something that people care about, really, really dramatically care about, actually, in terms of how to keep their families alive and in good health longer.
And Johnson did. Of course, he has like gained a lot of popularity over the year about what he is doing, and his whole like "don't die" moment. It's sort of intriguing too. But what he is trying to do, is he trying to live longer or age slower?
I mean, I think in his case, both. How you disentangle those two things, like live longer or age slower, they're they're kind of like a Venn diagram to some extent, right? They're very overlapping. The way we kind of view interventions into aging, and like interventions that have the potential to increase healthy lifespan, is one of them is actually like delay or prevent aging, which would fit squarely in this like age slower bucket. But then there's also kind of like three other areas of this field that we're really interested in that don't involve necessarily like aging slower to the same extent. One of those is like replacing aging, the notion of swapping out aged organs or cells with young organs or cells. Another of which is like the ability to actually turn back the clock. So the potential to actually restore age to a younger extent, which again wouldn't necessarily be kind of aging slower as much as like turning back the clock. If that were possible, the evidence is pretty unclear at this point, but it's a fascinating space. And then the third sub bucket there would be this field of human hibernation or cryopreservation. So in essence, there's a Venn diagram between aging slower and increasing healthy lifespan. And yeah, not necessarily the exact same, but like can be. Aging slower, it will either lead to a compression of compressed morbidity in essence, which would mean that you would in essence extend your health span, but maybe not necessarily your lifespan, but probably your lifespan if you're actually aging slower. But that aging slower isn't the only way to increase lifespan and healthy lifespan. Also potentially kind of turning the clock back or replacing body parts with younger body parts could also be ways to increase healthy lifespan beyond just aging slower. It's almost like the square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square analogy.
What's the difference between a health span and lifespan?
Yeah, so lifespan is in essence the number of years that you live, and health span is really more of an abstract concept that the field hasn't formally defined or constructed. But it's kind of this term that most people intuitively know what it means when they hear it, which it kind of roughly translates to something attuned to kind of like a disability adjusted life years is one potential way to measure health span. Or in essence, the way to think of it is in essence this abstract concept of just like the amount of time you live in good health, right? Where most humans live in good health until early 60s. And then suddenly, actually really like in your 40s and 50s is when you start to experience pretty dramatic declines in health. And then this eventually turns into this kind of period of morbidity of where 50% of people over the age of 65 years old have a age-related chronic disease. And once you get to like 85 years old, that number shoots up, I think, like to 80%. And so like inevitably, most humans have this period in poor health. And so health span's all about this concept of like, is it possible to extend that window? And in essence, just health span's defined as kind of the years you spend actually in good health.
Like when you, not you specifically, but just common term, when a person reaches the sort of after 50s, 40s, whenever the health starts to deteriorate, what really happens then from what differentiates what happens then versus what has been going on till then?
Yeah, so this is a great debate in the aging field is like when aging actually starts. And it's a controversial thing. The field doesn't have consensus on it actually. There was in essence a survey by an impressive professor in the field, Vadim Gladyshev, a colleague who is fantastic, where he in essence asked the field this at a conference that he helped run called the Gordon Research Conference on the Biology of Aging, and in essence, this conference was, in essence, the question that he posed to this group of over 300 scientific experts in the field was kind of, does aging start one at the point of conception, when egg and sperm, in essence, fertilize together? Does aging happen at the point of birth of an organism? Does aging happen at the point of puberty? Or does aging happen at the point of, say like 18 years old when you're formally an adult? And, there was complete disagreement in the scientific audience as to when that point of aging started, right? I think some people view aging as distinct from development in terms of making the argument that aging doesn't happen until after development. And then some people argue that aging starts immediately upon fertilization, that, macromolecular damage starts accumulating. So there's this kind of difference between like, is aging programmed, is aging stochastic damage, and kind of these two subsets of the field that kind of have different philosophical viewpoints as to like, what is aging?
The people have not been able to figure out what aging is. We do get old, right? How does that differentiate from aging?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so like, there is certainly consensus around some things in the field. But just with a lot of these definitional things, they're very hard. I'd say the field is very easy, like good at agreeing, in an abstract sort of sense as to what things mean and how to define them. And then it's really hard with scientists and these kind of like to actually like put concrete definitions around things like what is aging, what is longevity, what is healthspan, what is biological age. That's another, concept that I've tweeted a lot about recently, where the field is having pretty big disagreements in terms of how to define biological age.
The disagreement between what the definition is versus what the process is.
Seemingly both, actually. It's even a more complicated answer. And I think they're like, there's some good reason to it, which is just like science is really, really hard. These concepts are really, really hard to define, especially when, as we talked about, if we just look at the animal kingdom, like aging means very different things to different animals and organisms. But you're right, in like human specific organism, we probably should have more consensus around terms and kind of definitions that we do today. And I hope, thanks to people like Dr. Gladyshev, that helps improve over time in terms of us having healthy consensus around some of these terms.
How does our aging differentiate from other animals? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I mean, from one respect, we're on the long-lived end of the spectrum. Humans are in general a very long-lived species compared to species of animals, but we're not the longest. So there are other species of animals like the Greenland shark, or clams, even, or some species of turtles, I believe, that live much longer than we do. And so, for example, the Greenland shark has been shown to live, hundreds of years old. Sometimes I think even like 450 years old. The clams can live well over 200 years old. And if we're looking at animal like Hydra, like the answer, some people argue is like they're alive for thousands of years. And so, yeah, in general, humans were long lived. But we're not the longest lived, which is really interesting. And then in terms of how we age relative to these species, I also mentioned the examples of how kind of like health and fertility change with age. Where for humans, we experience this remarkable decline in fertility and health with age. But in some animals, like naked mole rats and the hydra and lobster, that doesn't happen, which is rather remarkable. And so I think that is one of the most interesting subfields of the aging field, is kind of using these kind of outlier species to really help get insights into how we could help humans age healthier.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I go back to the Hydra point a little bit, I'm not a biologist, but again, the research, I might be getting this wrong, but about Hydra, how Hydra reproduces it uses regeneration, sort of like you cut it somewhere, it regrows that part out. Why can't humans do that?
So we can for specific organs. Well, actually, specific organ really. When we're babies, when we're super, super young, and including in the womb, we have pretty remarkable regenerative capacity, actually. And one of the specific examples of that is like in digits, in like human hands, fingers. You could regrow a remarkable amount of your finger, I think, when you're in the womb. Another, example in adult humans that is kind of seen practiced on a daily basis in hospitals around the U.S. Is our livers. Our livers are remarkably have a remarkable ability to regenerate. We can actually regenerate somewhere in the magnitude of 70 to 80% of our liver, which is, when I mention used daily in hospitals, I'm talking about living donor liver transplantations, which is something that's undertaken where you quite literally have 65 to 70% of your liver removed if you're the healthy donor. And then it'll grow back on the magnitude of weeks in a very remarkable fashion. And so the question of like why, when we're babies and in the womb, we can regenerate so well, and why our liver can regenerate so well, and why can most other organs in the body not regenerate very, very well. I think that's one of the most fascinating topics in kind of the biology of aging world, and one of the areas that I'm most interested in people who are researching that area. Where I think we will see a lot of interventions in the future that, in essence, help enable tissues that currently aren't able to regenerate to put them actually in a state that can.
If you don't know, a lot of people don't know how it works, how the medicines work, sort of, if we take that as an example, how do regulatory bodies approve that?
Well, they don't. they don't like it as much as they used to, I would say. It's just like I think this wanting to know the mechanism is definitely a stronger priority for them now than it used to be, it seems. But in terms of how they would accept that, what the FDA cares about is how patients function, feel, and survive. And so if you're able to show via clinical evidence that your mystery pill that no one knows how it's acting is able to help patients function, feel, and survive in a very robust and rigorously designed clinical trial, that ultimately is what the FDA cares about, more so than the specific mechanism.
Is that something founders should know when pitching to when getting approval from the FDA or any regulatory body out there?
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that will be on all founders' minds as they're going to the FDA. If for some reason you have a drug that has a large effect, but you're not super sure of the exact mechanistic basis for that, and we've seen some, classic examples of this recently. It's also super pertinent to fundraising, beyond just regulatory, which is kind of more later down the line, but also like just fundraising for VCs. A lot of biotech VCs will have hesitancies or holdups for a drug where the mechanism is unknown, because in their mind, it adds additional risk in terms of the reproducibility or kind of robustness of an effect if we don't really understand how it works. So it's certainly something that needs to be on all founders' minds as they're kind of building in the biotech world.
What is biotech? I'll just throw it out there.
Yeah, so biotech is in essence a subfield of life sciences that is focused on developing therapeutic interventions to help humans treat disease, prevent disease, in essence, just like treat patients' health. So yeah, I really use it synonymously as kind of drug development, therapeutics. It used to be, classically there was a distinction between the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology industry, where pharmaceutical industry we think of as a big pharma. Historically, this was the group of companies developing small molecules for therapies and drugs, and then came along this wave of biotechnology, which was really inspired in large part by the company Genentech, where they really introduced the ability to be able to use recombinant DNA to produce proteins. And then all of a sudden we had biologic therapies and this whole new drug class. And then, there was this distinction between biotechnology companies and pharmaceutical companies. And, flash forward to today, there's really no distinction between the two anymore, as almost any company in the biotech or pharma world is considering using both biologics and non-biologics underneath the same roof. So that kind of, I consider biotechnology pretty synonymously with pharmaceutical company. Honestly, just the goal is to develop medicines for humans.
What qualifies as biologics versus non-biologics?
Yeah, so a non-biologic would be traditionally referred to as like a small molecule, where in essence we're talking about like chemicals, versus a biologic is something in essence produced by life. So some subclasses of biologics, monoclonal antibodies is a subclass that we've seen a lot of approved drugs with. Recombinant proteins is a subclass that we've seen a lot of approved therapies with. Genetic medicines, so gene therapies, is another space that fits under this kind of biologic medicine category, where in essence, the high-level distinction is kind of like something produced by living biology and then something that is kind of inorganic.
What difference does it make to develop something that deals with biologics versus non-biologics?
Yeah, really, really good question. So there's tons of nuances between these subfields. So a small molecule is probably the easiest at this point to manufacture and scale up. It's the smallest. And if you were to kind of compare the size of a small molecule to a monoclonal antibody, the difference is your tiny small molecule, and then you have your antibody relative in size. And so these small molecules are very small and really bounce off of the hundreds of thousands of interactions with various things and cells and tissues in the body. They're really kind of bouncing off everything. Historically, they're kind of thought of as like dirty to some extent because they hit so many things. So dirty in terms of like fidelity to only like a single target. They're just bouncing off of encountering a lot of things. So historically, they're also thought to have potentially a little bit more side effects than other drug classes, and as a result, they take a little bit longer to develop and screen for toxicity purposes. And then kind of on the other end of the spectrum, but small molecules were kind of like the origin of drug development and pharmaceuticals, and the thing where we have like kind of the most examples of small molecule therapeutics, and as mentioned, the easiest to manufacture and scale. And then kind of on the other end of the spectrum, we have antibody approaches or recombinant protein or gene therapies, where the huge downside is, in essence, the cost to manufacture them is much higher, and the intricacies involved in manufacturing them is much higher than the small molecule space. But actually, the side effect profile for something like a monoclonal antibody is typically a lot better than a small molecule, because in the case of monoclonal antibody, it's like truly, given the beauty of just human immunology, these antibodies are extremely specific, and so have a less likelihood of kind of off-target side effects compared to small molecules. So in general, I think the distinction is just this kind of like side effect profile, cost of manufacturing, speed at which you can develop these drugs, how you can administer them in humans. For example, biologics are typically administered via injections or intravenous, versus small molecule. It's very easy to, in essence, deliver them orally. These are kind of some of the highest level categories of nuances between biologics and non-biologics.
In which field do you think companies are more likely to exist? Biologics or non-biologics?
Yeah, I mean, I realized there's a full subclass of biologics that I missed to describe already, which is like cell therapy, um, which is true living medicines. And the reason that I bring this up to answer your question here is because like I think my friend Elliot Hirschberg writes a blog called The Century of Biology. He's a PhD student at Stanford and an investment partner at Not Boring, at an awesome investment firm. And he posted a piece recently that it was about how cell therapy is the end game of medicine. And these living medicines are really the end game of medicine. And like, why is that? Because, they're potentially curative for a lot of diseases, whereas small molecules have been curative for some diseases, but for a lot of diseases struggle to actually be truly what we would define as like curative or have curative potential. And so I mentioned this in part because I think over time, I agree with this view of the future. I think over time, we're going to see more and more living medicines, more and more cell therapies, and potentially see that be the end game of medicine. So I think that's like a future trend that we'll see in the space. But as for now, like the nuances between the two and the frequencies, it's really just it surrounds what you're trying to solve with your biotechnology company. In essence, and what targets you want to go after with that biotechnology company, which modalities you'd go after, whether that's non-biologics or biologics. So I think it's pretty case by case in terms of the frequency that we see these companies. And we see a lot of companies that span both, that develop both small molecules and biologic interventions simultaneously.
How do companies, how do founders know which problem they have to solve in the whole biotech field or biology field, sort of?
And I always go to a concept that was brought about in a blog post by Chris Dixon, the partner at A16Z, that talked about the idea maze, right? This notion of the idea maze, and that founders must progress through this very intricate maze as they get to ultimately the idea that they feel so passionate about and so strong that they're willing to dedicate, 10, 15, 20 years of their life to being able to execute and pull off this mission. And I think this concept of the idea maze is actually like a very fitting analogy for how you go about actually doing this. And like kind of highly recommend everybody just go read that blog post. But, I think the common themes of things that you have to do to get through the idea maze is you need to talk to a lot of people, talk to as many experts or potential co-founders or advisors or VCs or experts in any of the areas tangential to what you're interested in. And through that process, really iterate through your kind of like baseline ideas or things that you're thinking about. And kind of constantly be cycling between states of being super outgoing with all of those stakeholders that I mentioned, asking for a ton of advice, and then cycling to kind of another mode, which is like introspective thinking and deep writing. And I think by really like writing, deeply about a space, compiling information about a field, that's how you could really help crystallize your ideas of what might be the most impactful, useful thing that you could build that's also suitable for your skill set. And so, yeah, I see it really as this kind of like intricate cycling between introspection, writing, crystallizing thoughts, ideas, proposing things, and then talking to all the various stakeholders and kind of this dance in between the two until you make it through the idea maze.
The founder that comes up with the idea, do you think should that founder be a biologist, not really a biologist, but someone with experience in the whole biology field, or does that just have to be the founder and someone else develops the science behind it?
Yeah, so I think it can work really well both ways. So I think there are some founding teams that consist only of people with a biology background or biotechnology background. And then I've also seen solo founders that did not have a biology background that have performed extremely well. And I think the high level answer is I think you truly do not need a biology or biotechnology background to make a massive impact in the biotechnology field as an entrepreneur. But I think in those case examples where that did happen, common themes were that a very early key hire of the company was a scientific hire that had extremely good taste, right? Or if you're coming from a non-biology background, you pair with a co-founder who does have very good scientific taste and a biology background themselves, right? So in essence, certainly not necessary. I've seen all combinations of these things, but it's very important at least to surround yourself, whether that's a co-founder or an early hire or advisors that have, the scientific taste that only comes from spending 2+ years of kind of diving into a specific subfield.
But how does this really work? I mean, if you don't have on-ground experience with the field, how can you navigate the challenges that come up?
Yeah, I think the high level is people for some reason are particularly scared of or afraid of biotechnology as a field, and feel like a fraud working in it. Whereas I think a lot of the same people wouldn't have a problem pivoting into the fields of construction or mining or other fields that have deep technical expertise, but that outsiders feel less intimidated hopping into. But for some reason, there's this aura around the biology or biotechnology fields. And so, yeah, I really think there's there's no true barrier to these people coming and making a big impact on the field, as long as you know going in that one of the biggest things you learn getting a PhD studying biology is how little we know. And so you need to constantly be treating things from the standpoint of not making assumptions, not taking things for granted, truly coming in with the humbleness of, true kind of humility to biology of how little we know and how hard these things are. And just being innately extremely skeptical about a lot of things in the biology world. And then, beyond that, I think it just becomes, just talent that is able to, take on a lot of different challenges or new things. I mean, your job as a founder in part is to learn tons of jobs that you had no previous experience doing. And so if that's what you need to do, you select, in essence, the best people suited for that are people that have qualities that enable them to learn new fields very quickly and be able to, acquire and attract people with really, really good taste in fields where people haven't done things before.
What would you ask the scientific experts or the experts sort of that you meet when going through navigating this?
Yeah, I think people are usually very intimidated while going to scientific experts who have crazy domain knowledge. And I think more often than not, my experience has been that these professors are totally happy and okay with questions that you think would be considered very dumb or too dumb for them to want to answer or describe. So I think literally things as simple as asking them what areas they're most excited about, what areas in their field do they think a startup could be useful to solve some problems. I think answers as seemingly innocuous or as simple as these that you might be afraid to ask a deep technical expert, you'll actually get some great answers out of in terms of areas where they could actually see something translational happening.
Once you decide what the idea is, you talk to all the experts and you know where to go. What really after you set on what you want to build, what defines as the perfect way to solve that problem in biotech?
Yeah, I mean, just like with the process of the idea maze, I think even after starting something, you're just still kind of on that process to some extent of just iterating as to what your solution is. And, we have a lot of famous examples in our portfolio, Loyal, which is a company working on dog longevity. And the founder originally was really interested in developing gene therapies for dog longevity. And, started the company with that intention in mind before, at some point, just like this natural iteration cycle, iterating and realizing once she'd accumulated more domain expertise, a bigger team around her who was very capable, realizing with that new batch of knowledge that came with that maybe, other approaches would be better ways to solve the problem. And so, yeah, I think that that question of what the actual path is to solve that problem will change pretty dramatically over time and has in many startups in history, and is again just this kind of iterative cycle of getting all this stakeholder feedback and really pressure testing whether something is the most impactful or useful or the right solution to a problem, and just iterating until you do get to something that ends up being pretty beautiful.
At the end of the day, even after iteration, how do you know what the best solution is? Sort of.
Yeah, I mean, because it depends on how you define best. I mean, I think some people would probably argue that like, oh, the best solution is the one that simply wins market share and like is the one that wins financially. And that's kind of like how the capitalistic markets are set up. That like ultimately, whatever the quote unquote best solution is, will be the one that like gets the most uptake. But that's definitely not entirely true. And we've seen instances over history where like better drugs or, more convenient drugs or, something like in essence, like better paths aren't actually the ones necessarily that win commercially. And so like in some rare instances, there are disagreements on that front. But in general, I think the high-level answer is just like the free markets will determine and show you that over time.
Does that make it easier to invest in biotech companies, relatively speaking?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate over history in the venture capital world, for example, debating return profiles and whether returns have been better in biotech or better in the tech world. And I think historically that answer is really dependent on how you cut the data and what years periods you're looking at, whether biotech outperforms tech investing or vice versa. But in general, like some macro themes here, biotech it seems to get less ultra home runs, so like decacorns compared to tech world. But potentially the hit rate is actually a little bit higher than the tech world in terms of company success. And so there's this kind of like notion in the biotech world that maybe investors are shooting for 10 to 100 or really like 100 X's, versus in the tech world, people are really shooting for like 1,000, 2,000x plus returns. So I think that's kind of an interesting difference between investing in the two worlds. But from my opinion, I think the returns profiles are pretty close between the two industries, and it just depends on the year segment that you're looking at whether one outperforms the other.
But what are then if the return segments are low, then are the asks different too as to what a biotech venture fund asks from the founder versus what a normal tech fund asks?
Yeah, it kind of comes down to this notion in the biotech world of like biological risk, which is not a thing that exists in tech startups where they're all mostly worried about product market fit, and in the biology world we're all worried about biological risk and chances that just like a thesis just proves to be incorrect about whether a drug was able to treat a specific disease. And so as a result of that, like that dramatically shapes what diligence and time during diligence is spent on. Where in the biotech world, it's mostly digging into the science and really pressure testing a thesis that a particular intervention would actually succeed at treating a specific disease. Biotech VC funds do to actually diligence the science. It typically involves, most biotech VCs have teams that are steeped in science and scientific knowledge themselves. And us at H1 are no exception. Several of us, including myself, are PhDs, scientists devoted who have spent a lot of time digging really, really deep into the science of this field. That's kind of the first pass filter, where internal team will do a lot of write an investment memo, and as a result of that, do full literature search and kind of this primary research. And then there's also a secondary research component too, where, once you undergo that first process of really identifying like where your key questions are for diligence and what outstanding things you're missing knowledge on, then you go to kind of a broader network, whether that's professors, whether that's physicians, whether that's payers, whether that's, medicinal chemists or scientists or biologists, to really bring in to help you pressure test aspects of the thesis that may not be in your expertise as the investor. So it's kind of this hustle game of getting the right people to help you diligence something.
I think this will be incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time out for this. We'll take a hard stop there. One question which I'd like to end with. I've been into startups and VCs and all these things since I was like 11. What do you think is one fact that will blow them away in my mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think I still go back to this notion that there are animals out there that don't biologically age, it seems. And that's the part to me that I still just am always hung up on is like, how do naked mole rats and hydras seemingly not age in the way that we do? And like, just that exists. That's a thing. Like, they're out there for us to study. And yet the fact that we have so few people devoted to studying how these things happen blow my mind, because like, wouldn't one of the ultimate things that we would want in humans were to have the same ability to be able to not have age-related diseases? And yet no one does. So yeah, that's my fun fact, that there are species out there that are biologically, quote unquote, immortal. It's pretty crazy. So yeah, can't thank you enough for having me on. This has been a blast.
But other than that, I think that blue 50 will be mine. This has been incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time out for this. And I think that's it from my side. Anything you'd like to say?
No, that was perfect. Thanks so much for having me on.